clearly established a worldwide reputation as one of the leading authorities on Western Hemispheric economic relations, political economy, politics, U.S.-Mexico relations, the list goes on and on. He's currently serving as Global Professor of Politics, Latin American Studies, and Caribbean Studies at New York University. But what's especially interesting and important about Jorge is that he approaches these issues from the perspective not only of a scholar but of a practitioner, having served as Mexico's foreign minister from 2000 to 2003. On the academic front, he's published many books, many scholarly articles, many articles for scholarly journals. He's taught at Princeton, he's taught at the University of California, Berkeley. In his spare time these days, he is a contributor to the New York Times, and he hosts his own speaker series at New York University, where leading voices from Latin America's business community, political community, are invited regularly to give presentations. Just a few quick housekeeping notes. Jorge will speak for about 20 or 25 minutes. We'll then follow that with questions from the audience. Would you please turn your cell phones off if you haven't done so already? This presentation is also being broadcast along our YouTube channel, and YouTube watchers are invited to submit questions that we can consider for asking at this session. And at this point, I'd like to turn the microphone over to Jorge. And again, we're really happy to have him, and thank you all for showing up too.
Thank you, Alan, for having worked out this invitation to share a few thoughts with our guests, and for the opportunity to also speak to those who are watching us on the Henry George YouTube channel. As perhaps some of you noticed this morning in Buenos Aires, Presidents Trump, Peña Nieto, and Prime Minister Trudeau signed the new NAFTA, that's what Trudeau calls it, Trump calls it USMCA, and the Mexican president doesn't call it anything because he's leaving anyway, so he just wanted to get the picture. This means that there is a new document. Actually, there was one now almost 2 months ago. That document, together with its implementing legislation, will be sent to the U.S. Congress sometime probably in March or so of next year, and according to President Trump, will be easily approved by both houses with a simple majority. That is open to discussion, and we'll maybe get into that. But I wanted to use this morning's signature as a peg, perhaps, just to first talk for a couple of moments about this new NAFTA, whatever you want to call it, and then perhaps also talk about 2 or 3 other issues on the U.S.-Mexican agenda as a new Mexican president is sworn in tomorrow. This is the other event that is coinciding simultaneously, not by pure coincidence. It was worked out that way. Both the outgoing Mexican president and the incoming Mexican president wanted the outgoing one to sign this thing before the new one took office, was inaugurated tomorrow, because the new one did not want to own this thing. He has been supportive of the negotiations and of the document, the existence of the document, but he didn't want to own the contents of it, and that is why he made a big fuss, and the outgoing president did also, to have this thing signed by Peña Nieto today, which was the legal limit according to U.S. law, the first date on which it could be signed. And it's significant for a series of reasons I'll touch upon in a second. So, is this important? Well, yes and no. It's important because Trump wanted it to be important. If not, there would have been no new NAFTA. The case can be made, many have made it, that there were parts of the old NAFTA that needed to be updated, or rather simply to take into account a series of issues which did not exist in 1992 and 3 when it was originally negotiated. The most obvious one is e-commerce or digital commerce, which simply did not exist. There are others, but that could have been fixed very easily without opening up a whole new negotiation. This was something that Trump decided to do for his own electoral reasons 2 years ago or 3 years ago. And actually it probably worked out rather well for him because it may have had some kind of effect in the 3 states that put him over the top, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. He only won by, what was it, 72,000 votes off between the 3 states. So, you know, you had 20,000 votes because of the anti-NAFTA votes in those 3 states, each one of them. That made a difference. So the first point, this was totally unnecessary. Now that it's done, it's better than it was done for it not to have been done, and the risk always was that Trump would rip it up and implement the exit clause that NAFTA had, whereby you give 6 months notice and you leave. And that didn't happen, and that's a good thing, I guess, for the 3 countries and certainly for Mexico. So that's a first point. Yes, it's better that it exists than if it didn't exist, but all of this was totally unnecessary. Secondly, there are not a whole lot of things in the new document that really make much of a difference. There are a few things that Trump wanted that he kind of got, and there were a few things that Mexico wanted to avoid, which it was able to avoid, and that the Canadians wanted to avoid, and they were able to avoid. But there really is not an enormous difference between the original agreement and this one. Some of them, I'll just list them if there's anyone is particularly interested, and I know something about it, which is unlikely, but if so, we can come back to it in the discussion period. There is sort of a sunset clause. It's not a binding 5-year sunset clause like Trump wanted. It's a sort of non-binding, wishy-washy 6-year sunset clause with an additional 10 years to implement an exit if you wanted to, but the original exit clause is still there, which means it's really totally meaningless. Trump wanted some seasonal agricultural stuff involved. Mexico was able to stop that from happening, fortunately, but now people like Marco Rubio, the senator from Florida, are complaining about the non-inclusion of the agricultural seasonality, fruit and vegetable seasonality clause, and Rubio is a problem because Rubio chairs the Western Hemisphere subcommittee, Foreign Affairs subcommittee, which is not necessarily where NAFTA goes, but the Senate is going to be touch and go. It's always tougher to get something like this through the House and the Senate, but you don't want Republican senators against it. Mexico was also able to avoid the elimination of what's called the investor-state dispute settlement chapter, which the Americans wanted to eliminate. It remained, but limited to only 4 industrial sectors, not to across the board. What did Trump get? He got mainly important U.S. content or North American content in the automobile industry. That was his what he really was after, which after GM's decision a couple of days ago maybe doesn't appear as important as he thought it would be, but that's what he really wanted. He wanted to be able to say that he was able to include greater North American content, which in fact means American content because it means non-Chinese content, in a car, any given car built anywhere in the North American continent, in order to be able to come and go freely, needs to have now, I think it went up to 85%, something like that, 85% North American content. The way you calculate that was also modified. And a specific clause on wages in Mexico, well, wages everywhere, but it means Mexico, although there may be places in Mississippi where it's also relevant.
Touch and go.
But Mississippi is kind of like Mexico in some ways, especially as far as poverty is concerned. But anyway, that 40% of the car has to be built in plants that pay at least $16 an hour. No one knows how the hell you calculate this and how you enforce it, especially, you know, if you look at the size of an automobile plant in Mexico and you look at the amount of workers there are there and you look at the way Mexican law allows you to disguise wages and fiddle with them and fool around with them. No one understands how in the world this is going to be calculated, but the idea is, and Trump can flaunt this, as you may have heard, said this morning, this is the greatest agreement in history. Not the greatest trade agreement. No, the greatest agreement, as Alan was saying, Westphalia, nothing. I mean, this is the San Francisco Charter.
Westphalia Bupkis, right? That's
Yeah.
what we would say.
This is what comes from there. So, you know, what's interesting perhaps is what this new MCA did not include, which some people thought NAFTA should have included and didn't, and that maybe the same effects will generate, the same causes will generate the same effects. The Mexican economy has grown over these 25 years, an average of about 2.3, 2.4% per year. In per capita terms, that's around 1%. To say that NAFTA was oversold in terms of the effects it would have on the Mexican economy is to put it very mildly. And particularly to say that, to have said and believed that NAFTA was going to reduce immigration from Mexico was totally absurd. It not only did it not, but the largest increase in Mexican migration to the United States has taken place since the 1940s, between 1994-95 and 2008-2009. I don't believe it's linked to NAFTA. A lot of people do. I don't think so. But that has been the coincidence in time, whichever way you want to establish the causality. Which means that if back in '94 people had perhaps listened to some of those who suggested that NAFTA should have included other things, it would not have been totally stupid. Among them, there were three things that some people insisted upon. One was some kind of labor questions, which does not mean free flow of labor necessarily. It can mean that, but including labor does not mean it's that or nothing. It could have been an increase in H-2A or H-2B visas. It could have been the establishment of a temporary worker program beyond H-2A and H-2Bs. It could have meant all sorts of different things that were not included. The same is true for the question of having established some sort of mechanism for increasing the southernward movement of plants that were established in Mexico off the border, not keeping them on the border, which means infrastructure. If all of the plants were going to be concentrated along the border and in the north of Mexico, which is the most prosperous part of Mexico, then that part is going to keep getting prosperous and the rest of the country is not. And that's what happened. And thirdly, part of this is that in order for the economy to grow more and more jobs to be created and wages to rise, you had to increase the domestic inputs instead of having enormous amount of import components in Mexican exports. Mexican exports skyrocketed over the NAFTA period, but the share of imported stuff in those exports remained the same, about 70%, which means the number of jobs created in Mexico was relatively small, which means there was no upward pressure on wages. Just telling Alan, the average wage in the automobile sector in Mexico today, which is the NAFTA success story, is about $500 a month, which our average hourly wage, even including non-union plants in the South in the US, is around $20, $25, even maybe more with fringe benefits per hour. So a couple of long days with overtime maybe, an American worker at a plant can make what a Mexican one makes in a month. That doesn't work out. And the final thing that could have been included was some kind of human rights and democracy component in NAFTA back then. Why? Because back then Mexico was a country with an authoritarian regime that violated human rights. Now it's a democratic regime that violates human rights. It's certainly an improvement, no question about it. I'd rather have what we have now than what we had then. But that is the case. There is not a single instance in the world, non-governmental or governmental, that does not condemn Mexico systematically for violating human rights for all sorts of reasons. Some of the human rights are violated by some people, by other people. We have this trial now going on here in Brooklyn, which is an interesting case regarding corruption, et cetera, et cetera. You can get in. It's difficult. You have to, I think, wait outside for overnight, but you can get into Chapo's trial, and it's apparently quite a show. In any case, the point of that being that if you had included then what the Europeans included in their agreement with Mexico just 3 years later, a democracy and human rights clause, you probably would have had more improvement in democracy and human rights than you did then. And finally, the labor part, Steve, that was included back then, in the side agreement that Clinton insisted on, was totally useless because it had no teeth in it, no enforcement mechanisms. And so that's why everybody, or Nancy Pelosi and everybody, are insisting now on enforcement. All right, the point of all this long digression has been that none of these things, which some people thought should have been included back then, were included now. None of them. And so it's difficult to see why the same causes will not produce the same effects with this new agreement as far as these specific issues are concerned. I'll touch upon the immigration one for a second and then perhaps leave everything else open to discussion. Mexican immigration increased enormously between 1994 and the end of the Great Recession in 2009, and since then has leveled off. I'm sure some of you have read or heard about this theory of so-called net zero, that in fact the number is the same, yet no, the number of people coming and leaving is the same. Yes, because as many people called President Obama, he was the deporter in chief. That is, he deported more people, meaning Mexicans, than any other president in history. In fact, more during his time than Trump has deported in his first 2 years. And so if you count a deportee as a returnee, well, yeah, then it's flat. Now, if you ask most deportees how happy they are about being deported, they probably will say that they're not very happy. So this is not exactly voluntary repatriation, it's people being thrown out, which Obama did because he thought if he did that, he could get an immigration agreement from the Republicans in the House, which of course he didn't get. So we got stuck with the deportations, but we didn't get, or nobody got, an comprehensive immigration reform. The point of this being that there are still enormous amounts of Mexicans coming to the United States without papers every day. Probably fewer than before because it costs much more after Obama and Trump's restrictions. And if it costs more, it's just a question of supply and demand. If the pollero or coyote charges you more and the chances of getting caught are higher, then you will probably have a lower number. Not necessarily, and that's where the Central Americans come in. Because together with all the Mexicans, you also have the Central Americans, mainly Hondurans, Salvadorans, and Guatemalans, but you have some Nicaraguans now coming in also. Because they're leaving Nicaragua, most of them go south, but some of them come north. So you have those guys. And those guys obviously are coming through Mexico, which means the immigration issue is more present in US-Mexican relations than even when I was in government. It's more present because, as I'm sure you've noticed, we've got about 10,000 Hondurans in Tijuana that nobody knows what to do about. We Mexicans don't know what to do about them. The outgoing government tried to stop them at the border, because I think Trump really pressured them to do it. But they either chickened out at the last moment, fortunately, and rightly, or they simply couldn't do it. I don't know if you remember the scenes with this bridge across the river and the Mexican-Guatemalan border with 3,000 people on the bridge, the Mexican police stopping them, beating them up, et cetera, some of them getting through, some not, and then all of a sudden one of them, the Hondurans, got a great idea, which since the river is about maybe 2 feet deep, they jumped into the river and walked across. And of course, the Mexican police didn't want to get wet, so they didn't stop them in the river, and so they all came through. And then they all walked up to the northern border, so we had 10,000 Hondurans now in Tijuana. And this is a very interesting legal, political, moral issue, which I'll talk about for 3 minutes and then stop. One, it's an international law issue because at least until now, anyone who sets foot on US soil has the right to request asylum. Doesn't have the right to asylum, but has the right to request asylum. And that stands. Trump tried to limit that or stop it. So far, the courts have said no, which means that Trump is pretty much in the same situation Obama was in 2014 with all the unaccompanied minors. That is, the only way to stop all these people from entering, from requesting asylum and then being able to wait indefinitely here, is to not to let them in. And the only way to not let them in, really, is to have the Mexicans do it. And basically have the Mexicans do the dirty work. And that's what Obama asked Mexico to do, and that's what Trump is asking, pressuring, forcing Mexico to do. Which makes all sorts of things very complicated. The first complicated aspect is, as you may have seen, I think last weekend when they tried to rush the US border, the Hondurans don't want to stay in Mexico. That's not where they want to be. They want to be in the US. Not only because the wages are higher, but a lot of these guys have family in the US because there's about 100,000 Hondurans who have what's called TPS, a temporary protection status, who have had it now for 20 years since some hurricane. I don't remember which hurricane it was. So they have family here, and they want to come, immigrate to where they have family, which is perfectly reasonable. And so they don't want to stay in Mexico. So they want to get into the U.S. somehow. So Mexico has this problem where you have 10,000 guys in Tijuana who don't want to be there. And you don't want them to leave to try and cross the border illegally or rush the border. So you have to keep them down on the farm, so to speak. Well, there's ways of doing this. It's been done. You use barbed wire, you set up some towers, some searchlights, some guards on the towers pointing down at them, so they stay put. They have a name for these things. They're called concentration camps. That's generally what they have been called for a few years, and it's kind of reasonable for no Mexican government to want to have concentration camps on its border with the United States. Not a great idea. But then how do you keep them quiet? Well, you don't. So Trump pressuring enormously. The Mexicans are trying to sort of wiggle out of it, but it's very complicated because Trump is using everything to force Mexico to do this. And eventually, and this is the more moral and ethical issue to have Mexico sign what is called a safe third country agreement, which is what the United States has with Canada, what Germany has with Austria and places like that, which basically says that if there is a refugee in any one country and who wants to go to another country, like the Syrians in Austria who want to go to Germany, well, if Austria and Germany have a safe third country agreement, the refugees are forced to request asylum in Austria, and Austria is obliged to process it, not to grant it, but to process it. But mainly the refugees lose their right to try and enter Germany, the first country, safe third country. Now, if you go to Chapo's trial, or even if you read the New York Times reporting on Chapo's trial, the first word that comes to mind about Mexico is not necessarily safe. Other food is great, music is great, the beaches are beautiful, all sorts of great things. But safe is not the first word that comes to mind. Mexico does not want to sign a safe third country agreement with the United States because it is not safe. And a serious American government would never ask for this, because at some point Americans end up being responsible for the stuff that happens to the Hondurans, in Salvadorans, Guatemalans, Haitians, everything that happened to them in Mexico if that kind of agreement is established. So that's where we are today on these two main issues. There are other issues in the U.S.-Mexican relationship. A lot of things are going to change with the new president who's inaugurated tomorrow, but I just wanted to talk about these two for the moment, and of course, talk about any other ones that you'd like to bring up in this discussion. And thanks again for having me here and for the opportunity to share some thoughts with you.
Well, thank you so much, Jorge. I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative and ask the first question, but when we do go out into the audience, and we will have a roving microphone, as I understand it, would you please let us know who you are, and if there's if you're with an organization that's relevant to this talk and its subject, please feel free to share that with us. The first question, I want to make sure that we do cover this transformation in Mexican politics that's taking place. What, Jorge, would you say is the most important thing that Americans ought to understand about Mexico's new president?
Well, I'd say there are two, Alan, which are directly related. The first is that López Obrador's election is the result of a very widespread rejection of Mexico's traditional parties and political system and the way it's been governed for the last 20 or so years, including the government that I was part of. A rejection of the parties, a rejection of the personnel, a rejection of the policies, a rejection of the sort of culture, the trappings of power, including and power itself. It's an overwhelming rejection of this, not unlike what happened in Brazil also about a month ago, and the election of Jair Bolsonaro. A rejection of corruption, a rejection of the violence, a rejection of the insufficient economic growth, or mediocre economic growth, rejection of the outgoing president's kowtowing to Trump by inviting him to Mexico during the campaign and favoring him clearly over Hillary Clinton, a rejection of all of that. So that's the first that's the main element in all of this. He was elected with 53% of the vote, which by any normal country's standards is not a big deal. But in Mexico, where the only three democratically elected presidents, Fox, Calderón, and Peña Nieto, Fox got more votes than any of them. He only got 43% of the vote. The others were in the low 30s or mid 30s. There's no runoff in Mexico. So for Mexico, this is a huge mandate. 53% in the United States is not a huge mandate, but in Mexico it is for that reason. The second aspect is that everything that López Obrador has proposed to the country in his program, in his speeches, and in his campaign to fix what Mexicans are rejecting, or in my opinion at least, everything he has proposed is at best useless, and most of the time counterproductive. All of his ideas are totally out of whack. They all come from the 1970s in Mexico. They've been tried, they haven't worked, from just plain silly things like being self-sufficient in corn to closing down the construction of a new airport outside of Mexico City, which was 1/3 finished already, and everything in between. All of his policies are, as I said, at best useless, at worst very counterproductive, militarizing the civilian police, bypassing elected officials in the 32 states and appointing sort of proconsuls to be his personal representatives there, dispersing federal money. It's as if here in the United States, people say, you're the governor, Cuomo, guess what, Cuomo? You're not getting any US federal money anymore. Trump's gonna name a guy in Albany or someplace, wherever, I don't know, wherever you wanna live in New York State, that's outside of Manhattan, but supposing you do. So Trump would send somebody there, and that guy would, get all the federal money, which in Mexico is much more than in the US proportionately, and that guy would hand out the money. So you have these two things. What's going to change? Well, a combination of both. There's people are rejecting everything. It's a little bit like in Argentina 15 years ago, que se vayan todos. Get rid of all of them. We don't want, we don't want anybody anymore. And completely misguided, confused, unthought through policies to remedy these truly existing challengers, or whatever you want to call them.
Well now, I'm hoping we'll get some audience questions. Raise your hand and I'll be happy to recognize you down in front. And again, we'll get a microphone to you, so just hold on a moment. Actually, you get the microphone?
I keep mine.
Yes, you keep yours. Yes.
Okay, good.
You keep ours.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you for your talk. John Brewski, not affiliated. What is your opinion of what's going to happen when MLO takes over and confronts Trump for the next few years? How is U.S.-Mexican relations going to change, if any? Regarding the caravan, mostly. So I just want to get your opinion on what do you see the future for the next 2 years? Obrador is going to be with us for 6 years, Trump maybe 2, maybe longer. So what is your general position or feeling on what's going to happen?
I think everybody heard that one, right? Good, okay.
Well, what he has done, what López Obrador has done these past 5 months since being elected as president-elect, what he has said and done, because he has been involved indirectly in the NAFTA negotiations and in the caravan negotiations, what he has done is to try and placate Trump as much as possible to avoid any kind of conflict, any kind of confrontation, and almost at any cost keep things on a sort of easygoing, cordial field. That's what he has attempted to do quite successfully in these last 5 months. As of tomorrow, I don't know, because he has an enormous amount of challenges on his plate right away, starting with the caravan. It is my understanding that his administration has also has now agreed, and this is what the Post reported, not the Times, has agreed to the equivalent of a safe third country agreement, that they have bought onto this. They will not call it that, they won't sign it that way, but it will be that. But I'm not sure how much he's thought it through in terms of how do you, as I said, how do you keep them there? On the NAFTA issues, the big problem he's going to face is that there are going to be a whole bunch of US congressmen. We saw this, I think, Louis, you were involved, I mean, you followed it closely in 1993 when Clinton wanted to get NAFTA ratified. And every congressman, especially in the House, and every House member and his cousin and his mother comes up with some concession that they want. And so since you theoretically can't change the agreement, you put a side letter next to it, you have a separate agreement, you have a secret agreement, you have a public agreement, and everything goes. Everything. I remember one congressman, some guy from Florida, had a constituent who was arrested in Mexico at the time because he had done something, I don't know what he had done, and the guy just said, look, you want my vote? You get my constituent home. I don't care if he, ate 5 children, I'm not interested. I want him home. The Mexicans will say, well, what does that have to do with trade? And Clinton said, nothing. It has to do with the vote. You want the vote? Send me the guy. And since it was so tight, so I don't know how he's going to respond to that. And I don't know how he's going to respond finally when he realizes, and he still doesn't, how embedded US agencies are in Mexico's war on drugs. The amount of involvement by the Americans the last 12 years is beyond anything we have ever imagined. Much that I was able to see when I was foreign minister, that my father saw when he was foreign minister in the early 80s, that my brother saw when he was deputy foreign minister in the 90s. The involvement of US agencies in Mexico's war on drugs is beyond anybody's wildest, craziest imagination. And when López Obrador sees that, when they come and give him the information, I don't know how he's going to react. I think these things we are all still going to find out what happens.
Fran,
Okay.
Sachs.
I believe I was.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, however, I hadn't called on you, but that's okay. You can, okay.
Don't be,
I'm the guy who decides. I'm the decider, as someone famously once said.
now that the war on drugs has been mentioned, why do you think there's such slow progress towards solving it? And what would you consider a good way of dealing with the drug problem?
Well, I mean, there are a bunch of drug problems. There's not just one of them, and different people have different opinions. What we know now in Mexico is that these 12 years of an outright war have proved incredibly costly for Mexico and incredibly futile for the United States and for Mexico. There's nothing to show for it, absolutely nothing.
Jorge, could you just repeat the data on casualties on the thing, because they're really shocking.
The numbers are now, with the exception of November of this year, we now have numbers of homicides per year since 2007 in Mexico. But it's easier, well, I'll give you the absolute numbers, but also a comparison with the situation before. There have been approximately 250,000 homicides in Mexico over the past 12 years, so a little over 20,000 per year. The inertial trend, if we had continued the way we were until 2007, would have been about 120,000. In other words, we had brought homicides per 100,000 inhabitants in Mexico down to 7.5 to 8 per 100,000 by 2007, around 8, let's say, which is more than the US, which is around 5, but about Latin American numbers, and it's shot up to 25, 3 times as many. So 120,000 people have died because of the war on drugs. Now, Calderón and Peña would say, well, first of all, they're all drug dealers, so who cares? It's a kind of complicated type of statement. Secondly, they all killed each other. The army had nothing to do with it. That's a more complicated one. Because if you know who didn't kill them, you probably know who did kill them. In which case, the people who did kill them would be in jail. unless they're all dead. But that's sort of strange arrangement where they all killed each other and they're all dead. It doesn't add up. So it's an incredibly costly war and totally futile. Today, the issue is heroin, although it continues to be cocaine also, because Colombian acreage has gone up enormously since the peace agreements, which means cocaine production has gone up, which means cocaine shipments to the US have gone up, which means cocaine transit through Mexico has gone up. It's not the biggest deal, but it's a big deal. And heroin is the biggest deal because of the opioid epidemic in the US. And the Mexican cartels, quite intelligently, have shifted their money from marijuana, which is no longer really useful to produce in Mexico because it's legal in the US and in Canada, and we can't compete. We've lost market share. I mean, we're losing our edge there. And it makes a whole lot more sense to invest your money in poppy cultivation, et cetera. What's the solution? It sounds very cynical, but it's true. I mean, the solution is, if the United States has a drug problem, solve your drug problem. How you solve it, it's Americans' decision. I think legalization makes the most sense for marijuana and cocaine and heroin. But maybe Americans don't, then send troops. But keep the troops on the US side of the border. Send all the troops you want, bring them back from Afghanistan and put them in Texas. That's fine, Texans love troops. But it is not our problem. I hear all the time about people saying, yeah, but do you realize these are blood crops, poppy and marijuana, because there are kids dying in Newark. And I really feel terribly sorry for the kids dying in Newark. But this is not my problem. That's the way it is. I would just legalize in Mexico unilaterally marijuana and heroin. We don't have a drug problem in Mexico, and we won't have one just because we legalize. It's not true. And so I would just legalize it and let the Americans, fix the mess any way they would like to fix it. State-wise, federal-wise, any way they want to do it.
Okay, Steve, I think you've got a mic in hand. Good, okay.
Thank you. Good presentation. 2 questions.
Please identify yourself.
Steve Greenhouse. As I understand it, aside from the e-commerce changes in NAFTA, if we're still allowed to use that word, the main changes are on domestic content going from 62.5% to 75%.
75, not 85, I'm sorry.
And the $16 or 40%.
Right.
So my question is, will that make much of a difference to the auto industry in the United States? Will it lead to more jobs in the United States, and what does it all mean for Mexico? Second, if we had an enlightened government in the United States, and it were to consider policies to help Mexico, Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, to lift their economies and prevent immigration, what would you recommend that those policies take a sort of Marshall Project for Mexico, certainly for Central America?
Well, on the first point, I mean, it's very hard to say. If you just go by the news and the GM decision announced 3 days ago, it would seem that this new USMCA is not going to help jobs stay in the United States or North America. If you look at the logic of it, well, theoretically, if you increase by those 12.5% and you change the way of calculating it, that maybe adds another 3 or 4 or 5% to the North American content. And if you think that North American will mean more US than Canada or Mexico, conceivably you could have some automobile jobs coming to the United States. I think it will be so marginal anyway, in the best of cases, that it's really just typical Trump hyperbole, just making stuff up, and that there will be no real difference. Or you'll have some jobs being closed down and others being created, and the net will be pretty much the same. That's my sense, but I'm certainly not an authority on the U.S. employment market, so I really don't know. On the other question, what's interesting is that Mexican governments since Cedillo, since the late 90s, but mainly Fox and now López Obrador, we did it and now they're doing it, have been insisting on some kind of Marshall Plan or some kind of bootstrap, Operation Bootstrap with Puerto Rico, or some kind of European Union type of thing for Central America and Southern Mexico, which, you know, it's the same stuff. I mean, it's the poverty, the inequality, everything is pretty similar. And that makes a lot of sense for the United States, for Mexico, and for the Central American countries. We've been saying that now. Obama had the same idea, as unfortunately too often with Obama, he had the great idea and didn't really do a whole lot about it. But his Alliance for Prosperity that he came up with and handed over and gave to Biden to deal with, this was in 2014 or 15, was exactly that kind of idea. Now, there was no money in it to begin with, and then Congress cut part of the money, of the little money there was, and then Trump cut even more, so by today there's nothing left practically. But that idea makes a lot of sense. It always made sense. If you have American public and private money and Mexican public and private money flowing into these relatively small countries, you can fix the violence situation there, you can fix part of the problem situation there, you can fix a lot of stuff with money. What's going to happen with the money? A lot of it's going to be mismanaged, some of it's going to be stolen, some of it's going to be wasted. Yes, that's the way it goes. It happened in Italy, in the Mezzogiorno, it happened in Spain with all their boondoggles, it happened in Greece with no they didn't even get to boondoggles, they got to nothing. They just spent it hanging out and having a good time. All right, fine, I mean, that happens, but you can't, these are tiny little places. I mean, Guatemala's a little bigger, it's 18 million people, but the other places are tiny little things. I mean, they practically fit in the Bronx. You can, it's not real money. And you can make a huge difference by doing that. And if you do something along Alan's ideas of transforming NAFTA or ex-NAFTA and CAFTA, Dominican Republic, into something like a trading bloc with a common external tariff with all sorts of other things, this could make sense. Again, you're not, this is, everybody says, but there would be millions and millions and millions of people. No, there aren't millions of people in Honduras. There's just a few. There's not enough people to make a difference. You know, when I hear these stories, not forget Trump, but other people, there's 10,000 Hondurans waiting to come across the border. That's the number of Hondurans that come across the border every month anyway. They just don't do it all together. But they do it in little groups. It makes a hell of a lot more sense for them to travel together, by the way, in Mexico, because it's much safer.
All the way back there, all the way back there.
Thank you, and thank you for your talk.
Could you please let us know who you are?
Yeah, my name is Rob Figueroa. I attend the Henry Doyle School. I'm one of the students here.
Great.
I would like to ask you about the abuse of free trade and NAFTA, and the understanding of the move that Trump has done with the tariffs, because I believe it was for companies here would behave differently to keep the workmanship here. What's your intake on that?
I mean, you know, the sort of classical answer would be jobs are going to move to wherever they're going to move in terms of wages, costs, logistics, etc. And you can't really fight that in the long term and in significant numbers. You can fight it in the short term and on the margins with policies, but in the long term, it's not going to happen. No, that's first. Second, the real issue in terms of jobs is China, not Mexico. Mexico is peanuts compared to giant China in terms of how many jobs, whatever numbers you like. The Chinese numbers are 10 to 15 times more than Mexican numbers. So whatever, if you want to fix the thing, you got to fix it with China. I'm not sure you want to fix it. I'm not sure you can fix it. But if you do, first of all, it's China, not really Mexico. How much can you get done? I think with Mexico, you may be able to get some stuff done, but it's very difficult because a lot of these things are locked in by the companies, by the corporations. Perhaps they began with NAFTA or before NAFTA, but by now they have a momentum of their own. So, GM will close a plant in Ohio or in Mexico, depending on what cars American consumers are buying or not buying, what cars or what kinds of fuel emission standards or efficiency standards or whatever the hell are being subsidized by the US government and what are not being subsidized, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And if you think you can get into fine tuning this stuff, I mean, just think of for a second of the complications, the complexity of figuring out how much of a given car is built in plants that pay $16 an hour. How do you figure that out? Supposing you can figure out what part of each car costs, how much the design costs, how much the computer costs, how much the tires cost, how much the transmission costs, how much the engine block costs, and you add all that together, the design, the leather seating, the thing on the top, the stereo system, all that stuff, and you figure, and supposing you can figure out each tiny part, micro part, and then you figure out how much the wage levels are where each one of those things is built. Supposing you could even do that. And then you find that no, not 40% of the car is being made in a plant that pays $16 an hour. Let's say only 36%. What in the world are you going to do about it? Are you going to slap a tariff on that car? On the 4% that's missing? Or on the 100% of the car? Or on the 60%? What are you going to do about it? Supposing. Probably it's not worth it, because anyway, with the exception of pickup trucks, the car is going to enter the U.S. with a 2.5% tariff anyway, because that's the U.S. tariff on cars. Anyway, you may have noticed that there's a lot of Japanese and German cars in the U.S. And the United States does not have a free trade agreement with either of the two places. Some of them come from Mexico, but a lot don't. The Germans, BMW has a small plant in Mexico now in Puebla, and I think they may be sending 20 or 30,000 BMWs to the United States every year. But the overwhelming amount of BMWs still come from Germany. I think there's a place in North Carolina or something.
South Carolina.
South Carolina. Well, same difference. Unless somebody is from either of the two states. My apologies.
In the front, sir. Whoop, we got a.
Changing the subject.
And could you please
of-
identify
of
yourself?
Edward Nell, New School for Social Research, and Henry George School, right here. I'd like to know about oil. Mexico has fairly substantial oil resources and had a highly developed company that dealt with oil. Oil is now, having gone through a price rise in the last few years, it's now declining, and it looks as though there is going to be tremendous pressure with a number of countries producing very heavily, and with the United States coming to the point of being self-sufficient in oil, in fact, may become a small net exporter of oil. This is likely to lead to oil prices being very low for the next few years. And I wonder if this is going to pose a problem for Mexico.
Good question.
Well, the first point is that outgoing President Peña Nieto was able to finally get some kind of energy reform passed through his Congress, which means that some type of foreign investment is now allowed in the Mexican oil industry. And in the long term, that's, I would say, decisive, because we have been depleting, normally, our either shallow water or onshore reserves for the past 40 years. And what we've got left, we hope, is deep water in the Gulf. And the reason we think so is because in the US part of the Gulf, according to a treaty. Companies like BP made the mess, have found a lot of oil. Some of it they spill, some of it but they found a lot of oil, so we think there's a lot of oil on the Mexican side, but that's where it is, which means getting it out requires an enormous amount of investment and technology, which Pemex does not have. So that's what the energy reform was for, and hopefully that will work. In the meantime, though, Mexico has, we found our oil exports declining very rapidly, especially the last 10 years or so. We are now down, barely exporting a million barrels a day, when there was a time when we were exporting 2.3 million barrels a day. And it's not so much because of increased consumption, it's simply because our production has fallen. So that means that lower prices are complicated because we import an enormous amount of gasoline. So lower prices, we import gas from the US, lower oil prices actually help us on the foreign trade side, on the trade account. But the Mexican government continues to depend for between a fourth and a third of its revenues from oil. So if prices come down, revenues come down, and that harms us a lot. So depending on which side, what you want to look at, the fiscal side or the trade side, we're either in good shape or in bad shape. In addition, this is one of López Obrador's ideas, for example, when I was saying useless or counterproductive. He is adamantly, viciously anti-fracking. He has said there will be no fracking done in Mexico for shale gas or shale oil on my watch. Full stop. I'm against it. I don't even want to argue the case of the environmental case or whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. What I know is that what you mentioned about US oil production all comes from fracking. The United States is now producing 11 million barrels a day and is a significant exporter, probably exporting more than Mexico today, some of it to Mexico.
Amazing.
It's all fracking. Now, you don't like it, fine. The US maybe can afford the luxury of not liking it, maybe. Mexico, I don't know. But what I do know that it's either offshore, which takes 5 or 6 years at best, and each platform, each rig costs about $200 million just to dig the damn thing. Or it's fracking. If fracking is off the table, I don't know where the stuff's gonna come from.
Wow. Right in the middle? Hang on, hang on a moment for the mic, hang on. Yep, and here comes the mic.
My name is Fred Gundy, and I don't know, you're saying that the NAFTA is better to have existed than not existed. What I'm hearing from some people that I respect, like Noam Chomsky, is that the subsidies on agriculture that's given to the Americans, the United States people, the Mexicans aren't able to compete because of the subsidies that the United States agricultural industry is getting. Also, I want to just comment one thing about the jobs leaving. I don't remember we having a job problem until NAFTA. So, but what I would really like to talk about is the subsidies Americans are getting and how it's affecting agriculture in Mexico.
Sure. Just on the jobs issue, again, it's not that there haven't been US job losses. There have been enormous amounts of manufacturing jobs lost in the United States the last 20 or so years. The question is why have they been lost? Is it NAFTA, is it automation, or is it China? And if it's all three, how much corresponds to each one of the factors? My very unexpert opinion is that Mexico is a tiny drop in the bucket compared to the other two factors, but that's open to discussion. But on the agricultural subsidies, no question that in anybody's free trade agreement with the United States, The unfair part always is US agricultural subsidies, which should be reduced or eliminated in any reasonable type of agreement, and which is totally impossible with the United States. The United States says from the outset, our agricultural farm subsidies are off the table. Full stop, that's it. Now, what does that do to Mexico? Forget other countries. Well, the first problem is, would we be importing the same amount of corn, let's say, let's just stick with corn for the moment, if we didn't have NAFTA? Probably. Why? Because one, we consume a lot of corn for livestock, which is yellow corn, which is the stuff that is largely produced in the United States, and white corn for tortillas, which we all love and continue to eat in huge quantities. And I think that's a wonderful thing. But okay, you have to grow the corn to make the tortillas, and it's kind of special type of corn. It's not the same corn. Okay. The average Mexican yield for corn is around 1.5 to 1.8 tons per hectare. Average. There are places in Mexico where we go up to 8 or 9 tons per hectare, but that tends to be irrigated land. The average Great Plains, or I'm as corny as Kansas in August, US yields, that kind of stuff, is 9 to 10. The average US yield is 8 to 10 tons per hectare. There's something not logical about this idea that Mexico should grow corn. So with or without US subsidies, we still can't compete, and we shouldn't compete. The main point is we shouldn't. There's a lot of people in Mexico, maybe some 10 million peasants, who grow corn for self-consumption. They don't grow corn to go sell it in the market. They grow corn to make their own tortillas and eat them, because they live in extreme poverty. Extreme poverty is down in Mexico. It's between 10 and 15% of the population, which, depending on which way you want to look at it, not poverty, extreme poverty. Those people live off self-consumption, I guess that's the proper term. It's a literal translation. And most of that stuff is corn. But, would it be different? Would it have been different without NAFTA? Would Mexico be importing less farm stuff from the US without NAFTA? I'm not convinced. I think it would be very similar, because, we're just a country that is not very suited for agriculture, except for niche stuff.
Tomatoes.
Tomatoes, avocados, Super Bowl stuff, all that story, that. Berries now, we're beginning to become big berry exporters, but berries is a niche. It's a few other things, but Mexico has terrible weather in that it rains half the year and the other half it doesn't rain. And so you either irrigate the land or it's no good. And it's very difficult to irrigate the land, because either you have to dig wells or you have to make dams. And that costs both cost a lot of money, and go on and on and on and on. I mean, we are the opposite of Argentina, let's put it that way. Argentina can produce whatever you want. You name it, they'll do it. They'll steal half of it, they'll waste the other half, but they're still so fertile that it's endless. We're the opposite. This is not a country for agriculture, that's the way it is.
That's fascinating. Further up, back in it, right? A little louder, please. Thank you. Yeah.
Sorry, my name is Paula Hernandez, and my question was, as you mentioned, agriculture isn't something that Mexico can produce, but it's obviously really depressing to hear that the new president over there has the mentality of the 1970s, you mentioned. So my idea is, do you believe that he's going to change certain regulations that will enable innovation and entrepreneurship, such as like Guadalajara has the ability, has grown in the tech scene? Do you see that becoming a part of the spirit of Mexico?
It's very difficult to predict where he is on issues like this, which are very important, and which will probably make the difference in the long term for Mexico in terms of becoming a country with more jobs and higher wages as opposed to what we are today. There's a classic example of this dilemma and the way some people solved it or addressed it, didn't solve it, and what people say López Obrador's team believes. Now, I don't know this as a fact. In the 1980s, the Brazilians decided, this was around the time that personal computers were coming online in the United States, mid-80s. The Brazilian finance minister at the time, Nilson Funaro, decided that he wanted to create a Brazilian computer industry. And so he closed off Brazil from importing any of the initial PCs, Apple IIs, Atari or something like that. Commodores, all those things. And he poured enormous subsidies into a Brazilian computer industry. The whole thing obviously was wasted, it never worked, it was a disaster, the Brazilian computer never happened, and it failed, end of story. It cost Brazil a lot of money and a number of years in introducing the technology that comes from, and the higher productivity that came at that time from all of this stuff, okay. I am told that the Mexican team believes in this as a successful example. That the people governing at the closest levels with López Obrador say that Mexico will become a competitive industrial country the day it can manufacture a computer, a laptop now, in Mexico, 95 to 100% of the parts produced and assembled in Mexico. That will be the defining moment. If that is true, and if they are able to apply the policies that they think are the right ones, and that's a big if, it's going to be a disaster. And the temptation is enormous because it is true, as I said before, that the imported content of Mexican exports is so high and has been so sticky, so rigid, that you want to find ways of increasing the nationally built components of Mexican exports, which is what the Japanese did first, then the Koreans did, and now the Chinese are doing. But the Chinese can, let's say, can be more persuasive. They can say, you want me to buy your jet planes, Boeing? You like to participate in this market? You're going to build whatever, wings in Xi'an. I don't want to build wings in Xi'an. I want to build them in Seattle. Then you don't get to sell me your planes. Apparently, the Chinese are quite persuasive when they say that. It's not clear that a small country, by these standards, like Mexico, can do that. So then you have to find your national champion, and you can end up with the computer. And then you really screw things up. Seriously.
I need to grab the mic briefly because there's a question that lies just beneath the remarks you just made that I think is really crucial, and it's complicated, so it doesn't lend itself to a 5-minute answer. But why has Mexico's growth rate lagged so far beyond other large so-called emerging market countries? China is also incredibly corrupt. It's in many ways highly protectionist. India is incredibly corrupt, red tape up the wazoo, and no free trade tradition whatever until maybe very recently, but now their own new government is actually quite nationalist. But yet, both of these countries have achieved growth rates over the last roughly 2 decades, these globalization decades, that exceed Mexico's by orders of 2 and 3. Is there one central or 2 central problems here?
Well, I mean, the first point, Alan, I think, is that there is a middle income versus low income issue here. In other words, Mexico continues to have a GDP per capita, even in PPP terms, far superior to India's and even to China's. China and India started these 20 or 30 years off from a much lower base, a base where Mexico was maybe 40 or 50 years ago, And for a long period of time, it actually grew, not at Chinese rates, but it grew 6 to 7% per year. So there is the sort of famous middle income trap, or whatever you want to call it. When you get to a certain level, you get stuck there.
Right.
And there's all sorts of explanations as to why such different countries get stuck there. Another example would be Chile, which has gotten stuck at that same level now for 10 years, a little more, where there is, I wouldn't say no corruption, but very little corruption, where there is a rule of law, and they've gotten stuck too. So there's a structural issue there that nobody has a great answer to. Specifically in the case of Mexico, I think that there were 2 or 3 very briefly explanations. One has to do that too much was bet on NAFTA and, let's say, the structural reforms on their own.
Oh.
That automatically these things would work, particularly NAFTA, that, you know, if you opened up and then you locked in your opening up, which was what NAFTA was essentially about, and you got more foreign investment, you would grow. And your growth would not only be high level growth, 4 to 5%, your growth would generate jobs massively, and consequently exert upward pressure on wages, and consequently expand the domestic market, and consequently generate even more growth. That was the theory. The mistake was that all of this could happen, but if you just let it happen without doing anything else, you would end up where we are today, which is, as I repeat again, Mexico has way too high an imported component of its exports. We are an assembly country, or a maquiladora country in Spanish. We have not yet become a full-fledged exporting economy, which means all the other things don't work.
Yeah.
So that's one explanation, which I think is a very valid one. Corruption, yes, other countries are corrupt, but you know, China has what we used to have. China doesn't really have rule of law, but it has a rule of force. I mean, you know, you make a deal with the Chinese state,
Right.
and it will stick to it, and it has the wherewithal to do it. In Mexico, that's the way it used to be until, let's say, 1995. Since then, you can't depend on force to have contracts enforced, because the Mexican government can't do that anymore. I think that's a good thing. But you can't depend on the rule of law either,
Right.
because there isn't any.
Okay. I'm going to call on Lou there, who will identify himself.
Lou, you should tell, I'm actually retired, so I used to write for the New York Times.
Just like Steve next to him, by the way, just so we all know, okay?
And I wrote a book about manufacturing, and we all keep thinking, certainly Trump does, of manufacturing as a job creator. And we count on all the people in the Midwest to once again be employed once there are enough factories, etc. My question is, what I see is the steady automation of manufacturing, just as it happened in agriculture. We're now perhaps at the point where you can expand factory output with a minimum of employment. And are we near the point where we say to ourselves, this is all very good, we have to have more manufacturing, trade deficits, et cetera, but it's not a significant job creator. We have to go elsewhere. I would go to infrastructure, high-speed rail or something of that sort, but whatever you do, we first have to give up the idea that manufacturing is, increasing manufacturing is a source of great employment.
Well, I think, don't take me too literally or too seriously, but
I thought you were gonna say, don't quote me, but it's too late for that.
No, I never say that. Well, we were talking with Steve about that a little while ago. Anyway.
I'll call you up the phone.
Manufacturing employment in Mexico, if I'm not mistaken, has gone down over the 25-year NAFTA period. I'm not 100% sure, but I'm pretty sure it has decreased. Because enough factories in old industries shut down because they were not competitive to offset the new jobs that were created in the new sectors. I may be wrong, but I'm not sure if I'm wrong, I'm close to right. So on that first point, I agree with you. What I'm not sure is that if we have the demand already created for more manufacturers in Mexico, meaning all of the inputs for the export industries, just take the automobile industry as one example. If that demand exists already, should Mexico put money and policy and effort into, at the end of the day, what would be called import substitution, or not? And this is an ongoing discussion in Mexico, and I don't have a good answer. I like the idea of creating more jobs in that sector in Mexico, knowing that it will never be enough, but that some significant amount of jobs can be created in that sector. Now, what are the options we have? Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was gonna say that might be true now, but 10, 20, 30 years from now, automation might make your point inapplicable.
I agree completely, and in fact, there is growing automation in Mexican automobile plants. The companies have to think about it because labor costs in Mexico are still very low, so it's not necessarily worth it today to send robots down to Mexico, but and then you have to teach them Spanish and stuff, and it's complicated, but it's close. It's tight, and so some plants are automating, and some jobs are either, I wouldn't say being lost, it's the new jobs are not being created because of automation in the newer plants. The new Japanese plants mainly, Mazda, Honda, Toyota, the three of them are building new plants or just finished them, and there's a few other ones. Nissan in Aguascalientes, so there's that issue. Then the other question is, what are the alternatives? We can build an airport, which President López Obrador does not want to build, but okay, let's supposing he had gone on with it. All right, let's suppose it would have taken 8 years and not 5 years to build like the Chinese. Okay, fine. One day the airport will be finished and the jobs created by building the airport will be over. There will be new jobs working in the new airport, but it's only replacing the old airport. There may be more jobs in the new one than in the old one because the new one is bigger, what have you. But still, you're not. So what do we have? Well, basically, Mexico's big problem, our big problem, I think, and I'm not sure we have any way to address it. What we do is tourism. That's what we do. Other people, the Brazilians, sing and dance, whatever. The French eat cheese, and we are a tourist destination. And it's very complicated to find a way. The Spanish did it sort of, to find a way to really raise levels of income, of welfare, of prosperity, of education, what have you, through tourism.
Absolutely.
It's not impossible. It has been done, but it's
Yep.
and you want this.
Well, the same thing you could apply in this country, that it's becoming more and more difficult to raise incomes and wages and so forth through manufacturing because of automation. And going out 2 or 3 generations, we have to give up on automation, on manufacturing as the source of jobs and go elsewhere. Infrastructure is an obvious alternative, but that also, I don't know what the trajectory is. As far as job creation is concerned, I'm beginning to think manufacturing is not the source.
No, that I agree with. The issue is, for how long is it may be a solution in Mexico, and is it worth trying or not? There were, different arguments and counter arguments. It's hard to say. In the long term, I agree with you completely. But then the issue is, for a country like Mexico, what can we do? you know, with a population which is now still 130 million. I mean, it's growing less than before, but it's still growing it's large, and it's growing, not the way it was before. What can we do to provide decent paying jobs for an additional million entries every year into the labor market, and in a country where the average wage in the formal economy is about $300 a month?
We're going to be able to squeeze in one more question, which is way back there, and we need a mic, unless you, oh, good, okay.
My name is Peter Palmer. I'm a friend of Henry George School. My question is, if you were the benevolent dictator of the United States, what policies would you outline to improve or solve the immigration crisis from Mexico and Central America?
Well, you know, I would basically do what a whole lot of people have tried to do at one point or another over the last 18 years, including when I was in office, and then afterwards McCain and Kennedy, and then Bush and Carlos Gutierrez, who was in government, not in Congress, and then Obama with, what was it, the Gang of Five or the Gang of Eight, or who they were before Lindsey Graham went crazy or something like that. I mean, what were five or eight? I don't remember. Eight. Okay, those guys.
Gang of Eight.
Gang of Eight. Which basically, I mean, at the end of the day, it's three things. The third one, the Americans like less, but it's always been in there somewhere. One, legalize the guys who are here. You want to call it amnesty, you want to call it anything, it doesn't matter what you call it. That's what you got to do. You have about 12 million. You have to legalize them. You can't go on this way, and you have to find them some kind of path to citizenship. It can be a long and winding path, it can be a short, it doesn't matter. But two, address the issue of the future flows, because you're going to have future flows, which means what somebody wrote in the Times a couple of days ago, open up a big gate. You can have a wall, but with a big gate in it. Well, that's, you know, everybody's been saying that. You know, the U.S. economy or U.S. society, whichever way you want to put it, requires a large amount of low-wage, low-skilled labor, and we'll require that for the next 30 years, 50 years, whatever. So find a way, build a gate or build a door in the wall, in the fence, in the whatever, to bring in that wage labor that you want. Alan has always told me that there's two areas, and I understand that issue of the economy, which have not had productivity rises: construction and healthcare, sort of not medical
Right,
healthcare, but low
right.
nursing, let's say.
Right.
Maybe because of immigration, that may well be, or agriculture, certain types of agriculture, that may well be. But in any case, there will be a demand for that, so you have to address that. And finally, you have to address a little bit the question of development or growth or whatever you want to call it in the sending areas, which are not necessarily sending countries. There are certain areas of those countries. Not everybody emigrates from everywhere in Honduras or Mexico or Guatemala. Some people emigrate from from places in these countries. And if you channel money there, that can work. It actually does work. It doesn't work always the way you want it to work, and as I said, there's all sorts of leakages from a system like that. I mean, how many highways did the Italians build in the South that literally led nowhere? But literally nowhere. One day the highway stopped and that was it. There's nothing there. Yeah, well, they're right, they're Italians. So we're Mexicans. Yes, it's going to happen. Yes. The Spanish did it a little less. The Greeks did it more. Yeah, okay. The Irish did it very little. Most of the money that Brussels channeled to Ireland, which was the largest amount as a share of GDP, was well spent. Most of the money they sent to Greece was badly spent. And Spain and Portugal and Poland in between. Okay. But the solution is well known. It's so well known that 2 American presidents and I don't know how many White House staff people and how many senators and congressmen have worked on this, coming up pretty much with the same stuff for now 18 years. They just haven't been able to get it done. But it's not rocket science, because it's on the table.
We're at the gun, so I'd like to thank Jorge. I'd like to thank you all for coming too, and I'd like to thank our worldwide audience for listening in. I'll finish up with one fun fact. U.S. construction industry productivity is down on net since 1968, when I was a high school freshman. Again, Jorge, fantastic presentation. We're so grateful. Thank you. Thank you.
That much.
Yup.
The other one was health, right? The one
I believe it was helpful,
you
yeah,
sent me.
yeah. That's been, you know, no innovation, no CapEx, no.
Health.
It's, what is it? Yeah.